Greetings, everyone. We're waiting for some of our Berkeley friends who are stuck in traffic, but I think we'll begin because it's going to be recording. And we have a number of announcements tonight for those of you who are local. We're having a wonderful talk by Kathy Kelly, who is a very dearly beloved peace activist and has just come back from Afghanistan. She and I were working together on nonviolent intervention teams a long, long time ago. Yeah. Here's Carrie, so I'll speak slowly.
It's okay, just
yeah, okay. And that's for tonight. And as you know, we're starting a week of events that's called the Petaluma Peace Harvest as the first ever. And we are, tomorrow night, we're having an interfaith gathering at St. John's Episcopal Church. And there will be, I was going to say 2 Hindus, but let's say 2 people representing Hinduism. I, as you know, am not a Hindu. Gandhi said, in order to be a Hindu, you have to be born into a Hindu family. And so I've gone from being a non-practicing Jew to a practicing non-Hindu. That's my career. And so I'll be joined by a real Hindu. And then we have Hinduism, Buddhism, one flavor of Christianity, and Islam. And Judaism, yeah. And we'll all be talking about how our faith traditions relate to Gandhi, and I'll be pulling Gandhian ideas directly out of the Vedanta background that we've been talking about. And then the rest of the week goes on from there. We'll be giving you, there's a schedule on our website, and I think we'll be able to hand you out one. Let's see. Yeah, an interesting, well, I'd like to suggest that our remote viewing friends have the Google Doc up because there are 2 slides there that we're going to be using in a little while. Last night, we were at the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement. I was known as Mike Nagler back then. It was kind of interesting. Well, people were walking around with these name tags that said James and Michael, and I had to translate that into Jim and Mike so I could remember, you know, who they were 50 years ago. But it was really a beautiful thing, the spirit kind of reinvigorated, and I remembered how really amazing that time was. There's like no time has ever been before or since in this country. The spirit was just so exhilarating, and yet we didn't accomplish much. In fact, according to one theory, we were actually responsible for Ronald Reagan becoming governor, and then after the next wave of movements on campus was responsible for him becoming president. So when I found that out, I swore that I would never again lend my prana and my life's work to a movement that was going to not only not succeed, but bring about a counter-revolution reaction. So the rest of my life for the last half-century, believe it or not, has been about trying to figure out how to get it right. I know we have the right materials here, but how to organize it so that it actually gets done what we need it to get done. So that's my life in a nutshell. And that's why I'm particularly happy that we're launching into a discussion of constructive program today, because that's eventually how I discovered what the biggest missing element was. Gandhi said in a famous letter that he wrote to Jamnalal Bajaj, "My real politics is constructive work." So we're going to explore how that can possibly be. An interesting question came up about civil disobedience last week, and I'd like to kind of use that as a lead-in. But before I do, there was one other announcement that I have to make, and that is that next week we won't be meeting here. Instead, we will pre-record the discussion, which will be about the civil rights movement in the U.S. Everybody will watch that, and then we'll meet at a restaurant in Petaluma called Shree's Indian Cuisine, which is, they're pretty good, 4-star. And we'll be joined by some other people from the community. And that'll be one of the events in our week, a kind of a lunchtime discussion. We have no idea how it'll go. We have no idea how any of this will go, but it's going to go. And then the week after that, we will be back here, and we'll be talking about what's happened since Gandhi and King. I want to pick out a few specific campaigns to analyze. And then the last week, we have nothing scheduled. That was kind of our parking lot week with things that have come up that we put in the parking lot for later discussion. We'll look at that point. And there's also something special about that last week, which is...
It was also one that we were going to... it's a little complex. I'll have to work it out and write it down.
Okay, good. So another thing that happened during the week was I discovered some old versions I had printed up of the Sarvodaya Peace Plan. And it's a wonderful example on paper of the combination of constructive and obstructive actions that we'll be talking about. So I'll just tell you the background, then I'll hand this out at some point, and I'll also put it up on our Google Doc. In Sri Lanka, there was a remarkable movement started by Dr. A.T. Aryaratne, the noble jewel, Aryaratne, to combine Gandhian nonviolence with Buddhist social teachings. And they worked out this very harmonious combination. And they chose the term Sarvodaya, which means the uplift of all. And it became a huge movement. At one point, Joanna Macy went to a meditation there in Sri Lanka, which was attended by 600,000 people. I have to say, it did not lead to the end of the war. So we know that there's some kind of a disconnect between the power that people can generate in these actions and the actual social result that we need to be thinking about. But it was a beautiful example of combining constructive and obstructive work. And it's now the organization still exists, and it's being led by his son. So then, as I was saying, this question came up about civil disobedience, and I want to say something about Gandhi's view of civil disobedience, because it'll be kind of a transition to the constructive program stuff. It's been widely felt that he got civil disobedience from Thoreau. He explicitly denied that. He said he was delighted to find that Thoreau was using the word, and he never thought that he would ever find anyone in the West who understood anything about nonviolence, and he would have to start from scratch and build everything up. The kind of exposure that he had to Christianity in South Africa, and I suppose in the UK also, was one where, as he later said, the only people in the world who do not know that Jesus was nonviolent are the Christians. By that time, they'd completely sifted out that element of the religion, which could be considered the core. So I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bitter here, but he had no clue really until he read Tolstoy and Thoreau that anybody in the West had figured out anything about nonviolence. So he cheerfully used the term, and he was delighted to find it there, but it was basically his own invention. And there's an element to his concept of civil disobedience which is not well understood. And that is that in civil disobedience, you are breaking a law, but you are not breaking the law. What I mean is you are identifying a law which is unjust and therefore has departed from natural law, and you're adjusting it. You're fixing it by disobeying it, but you are not against the principle of law. So this is not chaos, and this is not anomialism, or anti-law on the theoretical level. And the way you prove that is, he's a lawyer, remember, and he figured out the law cannot tell you, Lucas, you cannot climb up on that tree in the middle of campus. The law cannot tell you to do that. All it can tell you is, Lucas, if you climb up on that tree, when you come down, we're going to arrest you. So if you decide, I don't mind being arrested, you can go through that whole process, and you're actually being a law-abiding citizen. You see what I'm saying? You're within the four corners of the law, but you are applying it in a special way. And now you might remember my friend Dan Ellsberg, who I learned so much from. There's one event that he passed through that was really eye-opening for me. He was in the CIA, and he had gotten his hands on these documents that showed that we were losing in Vietnam, and we were creating horrible atrocities there, and it was a hopeless situation. And no one in the American public knew this. And he felt that he was under an obligation to release those papers. But he was tormented by the thought, if I do this, what will they do to me? And as long as he was thinking in that rhetorical framework, if I do this, what will happen to me, he was paralyzed. He couldn't do it. But one day, for some unknown reason, I think it was actually Patricia, his wife, he found himself thinking, if I were willing to go to jail, what could I do? And the minute he put it that way, it opened up this panorama of things he could choose to do. Then there might be some things he wouldn't do, but he could release those papers. So when you're doing civil disobedience in the proper Gandhian sense, in that spirit, that's what you're doing. You're saying, given that I'm willing to be punished by whatever punishment is assigned to this infraction, I'm willing to do the infraction. So when you break a law and then try to escape the consequences, which a lot of students do, you're not really practicing civil disobedience in the longer term framework. And I think that's important for our discussion of constructive program, because constructive program is constructive. It's positive. It's not just, we're not just breaking things down. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk first about the general theory, the metaphysics of the thing, and then list the number of strategic advantages that constructive program has. And then I have a model that I've developed that shows the difference between a world based on unreality and a world based on reality. And then we're going to go over Gandhi's constructive program, the 18 projects, and ask ourselves, is this one relevant today? Are we already doing it? And so forth. So this would be the third item in the Google Doc for session 5, for those of you who are remote. Okay, so there's a kind of natural innate advantage to doing constructive program if you approach nonviolence from the point of view that we've been talking about, which is that it's based on the fundamental belief in the goodness of human nature, and that the universe bends towards justice. And there is a kind of, quote, nonviolence where all you're doing is you're depriving people of some of their conventional power. So Gene Sharp was very good at elaborating this theory, discovering the ancient thinkers who had realized that there's no such thing as a tyrant operating without the cooperation of the people tyrannized. Withdraw that cooperation and it's always a he somehow, his authority, his power collapses. So we call that sometimes strategic nonviolence, and sometimes in writing I would use the term non-violence, because you're taking away the person's violence. But the kind that we're talking about, principled nonviolence, is where you are engaging an unconventional kind of power. Okay, so it's a positive thing. So therefore, it's kind of natural to want to do constructive things whenever you can. But just doing constructive things is not in itself constructive program. Constructive things that aim at breaking your dependency on the opponent and eventually making his control over you untenable, that's constructive program. Okay? It's interesting that in the two biggest campaigns that Gandhi led in India, as we kind of skirted around last week, one was the salt campaign, the salt satyagraha. And I remember my friend Mubarak Awad saying, we need a new salt marsh. This was the climax of the freedom struggle. In a sense, that was a very constructive campaign because you're going and making your own salt instead of buying it back from the British. Just think of India surrounded, practically 4,000 miles of coastline, and they're being told that they have no access to the salt in the ocean. The other campaign of similar weight was Khadi, or Charkha, the cloth campaign, where you had people spinning their own cloth, which is why we have a charkha on the table over there. It's not why we don't use it, but that's just a technical problem. Oh yes, we'll have if we can put it on camera later. Stephanie is knitting a hat. So, so this is cottage industry. Look around you. I mean, this is a cottage, right? We were growing chard and kale outside. So charkha and salt address two of the basic human needs before we even get into the Maslow list of higher needs like bonding and meaning and freedom and all of those things. You have these basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter, right? Food, clothing, shelter. You'd add today access to health care. The Khadi addresses cloth, clothing, and salt campaign addresses food. So these were basic needs that were being manipulated by the regime, and he repossessed them. So on one level, they're very, very similar campaigns. But on another level, they're interestingly different, and that is that there was nothing illegal about spinning cloth in your spare time, but it was at the moment illegal to take salt out of your own ocean. So there's kind of a borderline where constructive program can include projects that are illegal and projects that are illegal because the regime has decided to make them illegal. And when they're illegal, it kind of shades over into obstructive program. We make our own chai, by the way. I'd like to say one other thing about the kind of, if you will, the metaphysics of constructive program, and then launch into the actual practice of it and how to use it. And that is, we can look on constructive program as kind of an extension. No, let's take away the qualification. We can look on constructive program as an extension of Swadeshi. Remember, Swadeshi means work within your own circle. When that work is accomplished, the circle will expand. Now, today, how to actually practice Swadeshi is not so obvious. I would even argue that when a person from North America gets training and goes to South Sudan, that he or she is not violating Swadeshi, because you need third-party intervention, and what's happening actually is you're recognizing the whole planet as your village, as your responsibility. But if you were to go there without training and just, parachute in and say, I have peace, you don't, let me give it to you, that would be known as peace imperialism, and you would be jumping beyond your circle. So there are subtleties in today's world as to how we should practice Swadeshi, and I think people err in both directions. They err in the direction of peace imperialism. One famous example of this, I've always thought that third-party nonviolent intervention. I almost said third-party non-intervention. That's what we practice today. Now, third-party nonviolent intervention was an absolutely critical feature of nonviolence. We have to have it. But there was, during the Balkan conflicts, there was a group called the Balkan Peace Team. They assembled people just to assemble them. No training, no teamwork, no nothing. And there's cases even on record of people who were in a bar in South Italy, and they saw a poster on the wall, come across the Adriatic and intervene, fired up their imagination. They jumped on the ferry the next morning and dumped themselves in the shattered hulk of Yugoslavia, and were a terrific liability because the people on the ground had to protect them and feed them and all of this stuff, and they contributed nothing, and that was really the wrong way to do it. Nonviolent peace force is the opposite extreme from that. So, if you take this interesting and subtle concept of Swadeshi and you look at one particular aspect of it, which is human competence, human independence, that individuals and groups, the planet is so well stocked with foodstuffs and air and water, stuff like that, that individuals and groups can practice a very high degree of independence. But you don't want to leave them in these isolated units, of course. You want to form a whole Earth community, borrowing a term from David Korten. So what would be the proper relationship? It would be one of voluntary interdependence. Okay? I grow more bananas here in Honduras than I need, so I will be happy to ship you some of these bananas. Also, I don't have any ships, by the way, so please come and get them. Give us a fair price for them. And incidentally, we need medicines. Hospitals down here, you have hospital equipment that because it's 10 years old, you're not even using it anymore. We don't have anything. Send it down here. If we had that kind of relationship, it would be what I call voluntary interdependence. And that would not violate Swadeshi. I am providing for myself as much as I can, and then furnishing the surplus to others to acquire the rest. Needless to say, this is not what's going on now. If you've read 100 Years of Solitude, Cien Años de Soledad, you have a very graphic depiction of how when people in North America discovered bananas, they rushed down to Central America and basically, turned them into, let's face it, banana republics to get their bananas. So it's a matter of the spirit of things. And, Madeline Slade, who became known as Mirabean, who was very close to Gandhi for a critical period, she made this famous comment that it takes a lot of money to keep Gandhi in poverty, because he likes apples from Australia, oranges from Portugal, almonds from Arabia, and all this stuff. So, as I say, Swadeshi doesn't just mean I'm only going to wear cloth that I spun myself, or it's locally manufactured. But we need a lot more. Whoops! Shouldn't touch my foreign manufactured exploitive, non-fair trade shirt. Okay, so if constructive program can be either legal or illegal, it depends. It's definitely going to be in accordance with natural law, but it might not be in compliance with the law of the land if the land is being mismanaged. So given that, I would say that violence, particularly in the form of colonialism and globalism, is the exact opposite of Swadeshi. And Swadeshi and its ally constructive program, its implementation in the form of constructive program, is the antidote to globalism. Because the fundamental characteristic of constructive program is that you're saying, no, thank you, I can make it myself. So I don't need you to take away my resources, manufacture it into a product that we can't afford, and try and force us to buy it from you. You know, one of the early examples of spontaneous nonviolent resistance took place in the Sandwich Islands in 1795, where the French, quote, owned the Sandwich Islands at that point. Île de Sandwich, I guess they call them. And they wanted the Sandwich Islanders to pay higher tax on the liquor that they were exporting to them. And the islanders weren't drinking the liquor, and they refused to pay the tax. So the French Marines landed on the island and stormed onto the beach, and there was a king at that time in the island, and he instructed everybody on the island to non-resist. Just, you know, pretend like they're not there. It's kind of like in Birmingham, where the Ku Klux Klan rode through the town and people decided they weren't going to pay any attention. You know, the cars came through, the guys were in their white sheets, and people said, hi, you know, y'all come in for a cup of coffee. And that Klan ride lasted about 2 blocks. They were utterly humiliated. They drove out of town. So that's approximately what happened here. The Marines stormed in. They got no resistance, so they couldn't kill anybody. There was an old fort on the island that nobody was using, so they marched over to the fort and burned it to the ground, and then said, Bonjour Saint-Denis, which is what the French say when they really feel like they've kicked butt. Shouldn't have said that. and they sailed home. So that was a classic example of force. Oh my gosh, I just had what they call in German ein Aha-Erlebnis. I had an aha experience. Okay, so the French are telling the Sandwich Islanders, you need this liquor. And the Islanders are saying, no, we don't. What is advertising? Advertising is telling you 3,000 times a day, you need this, you need that, you need this kind of toothpaste, you need that kind of car. And they are trying to get you to want things that you don't need. And it's basically domestic colonization. It's really quite interesting. I'm glad we're taping this thing. So I would say those are the two basic components of constructive program from the, what you want to call it, metaphysical point of view. I don't like the term metaphysics, but we don't have a good term for the underlying dynamics which people almost never talk about. I can see at the free speech movement meeting yesterday, I was talking with some of my famous old buddies, including the guy who sat in the police car for 32 hours and launched the whole thing. Try to dig a little bit deeper into the causes of things, doink, they glaze over. You know, they say that frogs have this kind of nictitating membrane, it's called, to protect their eyes. They don't have goggles, so, except for some cartoon frogs wear goggles, but real biological frogs don't have goggles. So they have a transparent membrane that clicks down over their eyes and prevents it from being damaged by water. And I get that feeling sometimes when I'm talking to people, that cloink, this thing comes down and the smile gets frozen. They're sort of looking right past my left ear and they are not hearing what I'm saying. But I think that's a tragedy, and I think we need to ground ourselves in the underlying dynamic of anything before we build our way up to, the strategies and how to apply it. Okay? So that's unit number 1. I enjoyed it. Do you all have any questions before we go on?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
It goes back to the beginning when you were discussing that what constitutes an act of civil disobedience as you're getting ready to discuss what the value of constructive programming.
Uh-huh.
And I'm thinking of movements that are just severely repressed, that people need to communicate, they need to get in touch with one another. So you have people, quote unquote, organizing and breaking the law in that way, but they're not ready to come out as, I'm going to do a public act of civil disobedience.
Yeah.
So how does that feed into the value of constructive programming in your view? I'm thinking like the Madres of
yeah,
Argentina.
Plaza de Mayo. Plaza de Mayo. There is no question that, this really gets us into the difference between 164A and 164B. 164A was squeaky clean. We discuss things as though they were just these basic, pure metaphysical principles. And 164B, we have to get into the real world. So I always used to say, hold your noses. We're going to get into gray areas, and we're not going to like it, and there have to be compromises. So although there is an ultimate principle of truth, which you never want to violate if you can help it, sometimes it means you have to say things that are not factually accurate. Now, I know that I'm starting us on a slippery slope here, because the minute you start doing that, you get into prevaricating, and then from prevaricating, you get into outright lying, and it's the same old, same old. But I like to think of this example of a German Catholic priest who hid Jews during the Holocaust, during the war. And when he would be asked, are you hiding these people? He said no. And so technically he told a lie. And he was asked after the war, this is a violation of truth, and it's against Catholic teachings. And he said, in that situation, the entire society was a lie. The lie of otherness, the lie that some people are not valid human beings, the lie of dehumanization. So sometimes you have to contradict the lie with another technical untruth in order to, just like, and then, the relationship is in civil disobedience, you're breaking a law in order to uphold the principle of law. Similarly, in these cases where you are not strong enough to resist openly, it's really necessity that you resist covertly until you're strong enough. And I found out recently from my friend Ken Burdigan that the resistance against Augusto Pinochet, the referendum that put him out of power, finally, I had no idea, even I, who pride myself on knowing all of this stuff, had no idea that 5 years prior to that campaign, people were meeting privately, secretly, for training. 5 years of secret training was going on. It was so secret that even Gene Sharp didn't find out about it in time to put it in his film. So there are times when that has to be done. And I'm not sure what to do with it other than to say, well, okay, I will say something here. Like I haven't been saying something for about an hour. Let me say something from the Bhagavad Gita. In the Gita's teaching on action, which I call the Gita theory of action, there is a verse which states, do not ever desist from doing the right thing because it's not completely pure. Because no action in this world can ever be completely pure. says you cannot have a fire without smoke, and you cannot have an action that's absolutely clean in this world that we live in. So it all depends on your honesty. If you're regretting that you have to be covert, and you're going to stop being covert the minute you can, then you're not violating any very deep principle, I would say. I hope you're all familiar with that wonderful poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay called Conscientious Objector, where she says, the poem is, I shall die, but all that is all that I shall do for death. And she says she will not help him mount his saddle. She will not tell him where the black boy is hiding in the swamp. She will not betray the keys of the city. So these are all necessities because of the imperfection of the world. And I think if we carry them out in the right spirit, we're not violating truth. Okay, I think that's the best we can do with that. Yeah. Jill?
I have been in so many meetings where the idea of civil disobedience has come up.
Yep.
And people talk about it a lot, and I've seen it try to happen. And it's really difficult to come up with a way of, like with these vast problems like of immigration and
Yeah.
the undocumented people and all the exploitation that goes on. It's really hard to come up with an appropriate law to break.
Yeah, sometimes that's difficult, and I kind of think that that's where constructor program fits in. Because if you do construct a program enough and do it well enough, you will bump into the law.
It's because constructive program is never discussed.
Greetings to PAX 164C. This is why we are here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think it would, there's no other single thing that would change the movement as much as an awareness of constructive program. Yeah.
I kind of had an aha.
Oh.
How do you say it? An aha.
Ein Aha-Erlebnis, der zweite Aha-Erlebnis.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of like, contemporary civil acts of civil disobedience that kind of fit the model that you described of Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's interesting is that they sort of fit the model of being the right person to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Then at the point they come out and they accept publicly, the way that the system's going to enforce the law that they've broken.
Yeah.
And where I see that tying in or dovetailing with constructive program is that you have the right person at the right time doing the right act of civil disobedience, and then everybody else is like, this is what's happening, and they've broken this law, and we understand it, so how do we build around the truth that they've helped to expose for us, in a way, or the lie that they've helped to expose for us, so that the work of everybody, of the masses, is much more constructive program, while the right person at the right time is much more the power of the civil disobedience.
First, I have to say with a great deal of regret that it's not that I would have done it any differently, given the opportunity, but we cannot quite say that those were acts of perfect civil disobedience. Even what Dan Ellsberg did, he went underground. And I don't really remember how that ended. At the end, he was up in the open, and we still had a judicial system in those days, and he got cleared.
Yeah, I think they were following the Gita theory of action, though. If, no act can be.
Yeah.
Bad, so
yeah. This is very awkward, I have to say. There are these gray areas. I don't know whether to say that. If they wanted to follow civil disobedience as she is spoke, a friend of mine in the linguistics department had a kind of spoof pamphlet on English as she is spoke for foreigners. If they really, really wanted to do it, they would have stood forth and said, "I'm Edward Snowden. I've revealed these things. Now do your worst." That would have been pure civil disobedience. But that's as far as I'm going. I'm not saying he was wrong. I'm saying what we should do then as a people is to say we will not prosecute him, we will not persecute him. What he did was in obedience to a higher law, and it should go to the Supreme Court. There is a law, a principle in American law called greater damage or something like that, where you have to break a law in order to protect yourself, like you have to bang on a missile silo because the threat of nuclear war does you more harm than...
It's called necessity defense.
Necessity defense. Thank you, Peggy. Yeah. You will be our legal counsel from now on. Yeah. The necessity defense. So I think that could be invoked, and he could be, both of those people could be rehabilitated and made, given due credit for what they've done. As a society, that's what we should do. Knowing that we can't, they may have done the most prudent thing.
Right, because one could argue that the Supreme Court has been taken over.
Yeah.
And so it's no longer a functioning institution, so
Mm-hmm.
where do you go? It's not like we're in
Yeah.
Denmark here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are areas where there's no obvious answer. There's no ready answer. And I think that maybe in the end, it comes down to the individual. Just as we say in a case of personal self-defense, if somebody jumps you, what should you do? Well, it kind of depends on who you are and what's your state of preparedness at that time. If you feel that you have a mechanism for saying, I'm not going to hit you back, but I'm not going to give you my wallet, do your worst. If you're strong enough to do that, you should do that. There are these very hairy gray areas. Yeah, Peggy?
I didn't bring this up last week because it came just as we were starting and
Mm-hmm.
we had a lot to cover. But when I left the week before, I heard on PBS, and just as I was in and out of my car, this interview came on, and it was of a man who was a Quaker.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if it was the person that you know that's also mentioned in your books, David Hart.
Hartso, I have an article about him right here.
But yeah, he was talking about the moral imperative of the moral issue of the environment and taking coal out of the Appalachian Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been a recent, he didn't call it an act of civil disobedience. He corrected the interviewer and said it was an act of direct action.
Uh-huh.
And so he was taking it out of civil disobedience
Mhm.
and putting it into more of an individual place where I wrote some notes down quickly in the middle of this, so I'm not sure I...
You weren't driving at the time, I hope.
No, I pulled over.
Okay.
He said that there's a certain serendipity,
Uh-huh.
use that word, that happens when these
Yeah.
things occur.
Yeah.
He said he realized on this particular issue that his heart leapt with joy because he knew this was his work to do.
Hmm.
So there's always going to be this real individual kind
Uh-huh.
of moral weighing of
Yeah.
what to do and if and when to take an action.
Uh-huh.
He called it moral imperative. You make the moral imperative visible
Uh-huh.
through the direct action.
Okay.
And he said there has to be a commitment. You do have to have the commitment to lay your life down for something
Uh-huh.
that you truly believe is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
This is where I learned about necessity defense,
Uh-huh.
because in taking the action, you're doing something that's against the law in order to make something better and to bring to light that there's an issue that needs to be resolved. And,
Well, the issue has to be more threatening if left alone than if you act.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. And then, and they were very upfront about everything so that there was total transparency. They
Uh-huh.
went ahead to say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to be here
Mhm.
at this time.
Mhm.
And what was interesting for me at the time of hearing this was that so many of the concepts that we have been discussing actually were here in this one particular interview, and I can understand more
Good.
clearly exactly
Good.
what was transpiring and the
Yeah.
dynamics around it.
Good. Very good. That is basically the point, that we can really, okay, your heart leaps with joy, you have a moral imperative, all of those things are necessary but not sufficient. At some point we need to know what we're doing. We need to be able to talk about it with one another, and so we need an agreed upon vocabulary. And we're not quite there yet with nonviolence, because nonviolence, direct action, civil disobedience, these terms kind of bounce around, and they don't have a very clear definition as yet. And we've just been writing about nonviolent direct action for that reason. Yeah. Okay, good. This has been very useful. So I want to go over now to strategic advantages. And you will notice that there's a very deep principle here that people like Kant and Gandhi and Weber and a few others have espoused, and that is that if you do what we want to call the morally right thing, it will also be the most effective thing. Even though we've just been talking about some gray areas, and there's a huge gray area that I didn't touch upon yet, where what would you do in a state of extreme emergency when the only way you could prevent an act of extreme violence, like a school massacre or something like that, would be to kill someone. You would do it. You would kill that person, but you would do it with the attitude that I have no hatred toward that person, I have no fear of what's going to happen to me, and I am definitely not going to look upon this as a resolution to be carried out in other scenarios. Instead, I'm going to say, how could we have degenerated to this point where people are shooting children, and I'm going to tithe a good chunk of my time for the rest of my life to solving this problem. Now, if you do it with this attitude, which is not easy, I mean, how are you not going to have fear if somebody walks into your classroom with a machine gun? But if you can, to the extent that you can approximate your mental state to that attitude, I'm even going to say that that is not an act of violence that you're doing, because violence means the intention to harm, and your intention is to protect. Okay, but this does not mean that we should arm every teacher to defend our classrooms. That would be a violation of the principle. So you can get into an emergency zone. Come to think of it, we should maybe put this in the escalation curve. You get into an emergency zone where the rules are not going to be played out in a very clear way. But we must know very clearly in our mind what those rules are. Okay. So I'd like to go over now to why constructive programming is so helpful and necessary. I have a picture here. Is this showing up well on the camera?
No, yes, you're not to do that.
Okay, don't do that. Okay. Imagine, if you will, some of you are probably familiar with Picasso's dove. It's the creature has two wings, and one of those wings is called constructive program, and the other is called obstructive program, or satyagraha. And in between those two wings, this creature also has a brain. And those three elements are all necessary for a long-term campaign. It may not be necessary for a one-off action, but in order to really mount a campaign against a seriously entrenched injustice, which is what we're living under now, and it was quite remarkable considering last night some of the things that happened 50 years ago and some of the things that could not have happened today. If there's a really deeply entrenched injustice, it's going to require both of these dimensions, when to be constructive, when to be resistant, and the knowledge of when to do which. And in India, which was the I think, almost the only complete example of all these three elements operating harmoniously. They were able to do that because of a phenomenon known as Mahatma Gandhi. They implicitly obeyed him. If he said, okay, call off constructive program, we got to go over to resistance now, or vice versa. In the end, within a few days, 100 million people were doing that. Incidentally, I probably shouldn't say this, but here we go. I had one moment of glory in the free speech movement. It was just before the faculty met in the academic senate to decide whether the students were in the right or in the wrong. So we had been struggling and fighting and working for months to come up to this climax. We had a big meeting in the Graduate Student Assembly, which was kind of leading the show. And everybody was saying, let's block their way so they can't even get into the building, and let's wear these placards and set fire to the place. Well, nobody went quite that far. But I got up and I said, this isn't going to make me very popular, but I feel I have to say this. I said, look, we don't know what the faculty is going to say. So why should we protest as though they were going to say something wrong when we don't even know? I mean, this is a kind of wrong escalation that always happens in campaigns where you're against the person and not against the issue. And they were persuaded. I mean, my colleagues were all persuaded. People were saying afterwards, who was that person? And so we didn't protest, and the faculty voted about something like 615 to 210 in our favor. There was a humongous, when they came out, people greeted them with tears of joy. And so you have to have some sort of a brain somewhere in the operation, whether it's in a single person or not, that can tell you when to do which. Otherwise, you're stuck in one mode of operation, and you're inevitably going to come into a situation where that mode is the wrong mode to be in. So the advantages of constructive program. Now, some of you have probably read all about this in one of those classic studies called Search for a Nonviolent Future or Nonviolent Handbook, or there may be others. Yeah. I'm willing to go that far. And maybe you'd like to, we could all kind of list them together and kind of put them up here on the board. Can I get up and write on the board without upsetting the... So. Sorry? What are the advantages of constructive program? Yeah.
Lessens your dependence on the status quo.
Yep.
Exploitative relationship.
Yeah. Okay, reduces dependency, possibly to 0, so that, for example, if you are weaving your own cloth, you can say, thanks. His penmanship is better than mine. If you're weaving your own cloth and you don't have to go around naked, you can say to the British, we don't need your cloth. Okay, that's a big one. So that's the Swadeshi element right there. So it might be possibly the biggest. What are some of the others?
It builds personal power, or builds power.
Yes, it empowers individuals, and I guess we can add something to that. It bonds the community, because we're always talking about we have to put up a united front. That was the term that we used in the free speech. We have to put up a united front. Doesn't matter how much I hate you, and you're a communist and I'm a Democrat. Doesn't matter. We have to put up a united front. But there is it's a well-known, well-established fact by sociologists that nothing brings people together more than working on something together. There's this famous experiment called the Robbers Cave experiment, took place, I think somewhere in the Midwest. There was a summer camp, and the counselors were sociologists. Don't ever send your kid to a camp like this. And so they divided all of the campers into, I think, the eagles and the serpents, something like that. And given human psychology, within 2 weeks, these kids were at one another's throats. They were not eating together in the lunchroom. Every sport, it was the eagles against the serpents, you know, and the place was just about split down the middle, and in a short period of time. And so all these sociologists and psychologists were thinking of a mechanism to get them back together. So I know what, if we see a movie together. So they would see a movie together, and they would, you know, the eagles would sit on one side, the serpents on the other side. They'd come out just as hostile as before. But one day when they had to go into town, the truck broke down, and they all had to work on fixing the truck together. And they noticed that immediately the hostility started to dissolve. So at that point, the clever sociologists, fiends that they are, they started like going out and taking off the distributor cap so the truck wouldn't work, and, you know, unplugging something in the pump so there was no water. So all these projects that the kids had to work on together, and very quickly they overrode the difference. So this is a huge thing in constructive program. And now this doesn't mean, I mean, you also have to be able to make that work psychologically. In the Khadi campaign, people were spinning cloth by themselves. They also would get together, and you see there's these newsreels of like 200 women sitting on the Maidan, you know, in the field, all spinning together, 200 wheels humming away. But also, the cloth was collected and woven and brought to, it was created a whole network of manufacturing khadi, the cloth, and selling it, and so forth. So it was very collective. Okay, so this is kind of unity in space. What else?
Carol gives meaning and purpose to life.
This is really good. Yeah. This is empowerment squared. In fact, even obstructive program can give meaning and purpose. You know, the classic example that I have in Search for a Nonviolent Future is the first Intifada, when the young kids, the Shabab, who were causing all of this trouble, were they got engaged in the actions, both constructive and obstructive, and in no time they'd stop taking drugs. So you can imagine what kind of power this has. Once again, looking at the power within the person, not external. Yeah?
In terms of breaking, like the idea of empowering individuals and building community, I'm thinking that constructive program also offers a way to, how to say, break down those divisions of labor that are sometimes very gendered or sometimes very hierarchical.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you know, it's, you have, you know, this kind of unity and diversity. And working together on the daily life things that sometimes would be relegated to one group or another. So, for example, what would be considered women's work, or in the Indian freedom struggle, the work of the untouchables. All of a sudden, like the question of like cleaning up your own bathrooms became a real central point of constructive program, because it's actually breaking down that kind of sexist, racist hierarchy that is constructed in other models.
This is a very interesting point, and of course Gandhi was almost more passionate about breaking down the artificial exploitive barriers within Indian society than he was about getting the British to stop doing it to them. And in fact, he felt that was prerequisite. Now, in theory, you could carry out constructive program without using it that way. Like you could have the women doing the women's work, etc., as part of a campaign of constructive program. But it also furnishes a terrific opportunity for equalization. If we have any time today, I was going to get to talk about Gandhian economics, and one of the key elements in Gandhian economics is what he called bread labor. He got this from John Ruskin, and that means have everybody work on some basic, fundamental need of the community. Everybody, regardless of who you are. So, you're going to have a PhD, but spend an hour a day spinning. No one's taking away your PhD. No one's telling you not to use it. You can even use your PhD to earn a living, but do bread labor so that you cannot look down on the person who comes in to empty the waste paper basket in your office. Yeah. So, and now what I'm going to say about that, Stephanie, is I think that constructive program carried out in a nonviolent campaign would lend itself to that kind of unity, whereas just plain work in an exploitive campaign seems to lend itself to exploitation and disunity. The reason I'm saying that is, as I say, theoretically you could do constructive program and not add to that the element of bread labor and breaking down status barriers. Theoretically. But I think as a natural outcome, if you have a nonviolent attitude, you would want to use it for that reason. Okay, so there's one other thing. Yeah.
It manifests an alternative.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can talk about an alternative till the cows come home, but until when you actually do it, that adds another dimension. Put that down, Lucas, and I'm going to expand on that a little bit, with your permission. Okay. Okay. Very nice. Okay. So what I want to do by way of expanding that is just, I think this really hits upon the key feature of constructive program and what really gives it its power. And let's see, let's start this way. You may be vaguely aware of something called the Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso. It was an uprising that took place in Peru. The guerrillas became extremely effective. They got to the point where they could kill anybody, and they started running into some questionable results, like they would kill a policeman, quote unquote, only to discover that the policeman was actually a person and therefore had a family. And so, they had alienated an important family in the community. Long story short, this movement failed not because they were overcome by the government, but because they had shown that they were capable of destruction, but they had not shown that they were capable of construction. And in the end, the deepest drive of human beings in community, I know this is a broad generalization, but I'll try and use a few narrow generalizations later to balance it. But I think it's true to say that in their political life, people strive for unity, for order, and away from chaos, always. And even people who are doing chaotic things are doing it because they think it's establishing order. Like, if we just get rid of the bad guys, we'll have a clean, ordered society, not realizing that the getting rid of is in itself the strongest kind of disorder. In 1972, when people from a certain party, I won't mention, wanted to disrupt George McGovern's presidential bid, the campaign Democratic nomination was taking place in Florida. It was not a strategically good idea. And they sent in a bunch of people to disrupt, make clamor, and really made kind of a disgrace, a shambles out of the Democratic presidential nomination. And as a result, McGovern, who was the only president that I actually voted for, as opposed to voting against the other guy, it was like almost the second biggest defeat in my lifetime. I think the first biggest being Barry Goldwater. Why? Because, and this was Dan Ellsberg who gave me this word, they made it look like the Democrats were the party of disorder. And people will never vote for disorder. Now, I am going to go on record as saying something that may sound unpatriotic, but it's actually super patriotism. I think what the United States of America is doing in the world today is what the Sendero Luminoso did in Peru, which is to show that we can bomb anybody, but we can't build a damn thing. And the world community is turning against us for that reason. Quite right, too. So, if you mount your whole campaign on the basis of we can obstruct, eventually the reference public is the term that they use, the people whose cooperation you need in order to have authority and create a new order are going to turn against you. And this is why, tragically enough, when we were demonstrating against the Vietnam War on campus and threatening to shut the place down, Ronald Reagan, who was then governor of California, said to one of his aides, "What should I do about this?" The aide said, "You keep that going as long as you can. That is your ticket to the presidency." Because as long as the people saw us, I wasn't actually very active at that time, but saw students being disruptive and shutting down an institution of the government, university is an institution of the state government, rendering it inoperative, and not embodying an alternative, we lost, basically. We lost heavily. We actually created a monster who ran this country into the ground in 8 years. The presidents who are the most destructive now are Reagan people. That's exactly the ideology that they're coming from. So, within the manifesting the alternative, I'd say there's a special category for which we have a technical term of building alternative institutions. I suppose that's worth putting down there, because, yeah. Particularly institutions of governance. This is huge. Look at Tahrir Square, uprising, and Arab Spring generally. What do you see? You see that people had a tremendous popular appeal, and they were able to drive a dictatorship that was 30 years old out of power. Basically put Mubarak in a hospital. Sorry. But they were not able to rule a country afterwards, because what they did was create a vacuum. So the most important feature of constructive program, I now think, is the ability to create at least the basis, the infrastructure for a new order before you tear down the old one. Then tearing down the old one becomes relatively easy, because millions of people will say, hey, we know there's another one we can go over to. Whereas what we're saying to them now is cling to the old order or chaos. And they just, human nature just won't let them do any differently. Yeah.
I was thinking of a conversation I recently had about the Zapatistas.
Uh-huh.
And the advantage of constructive program and recognizing the constructive program as a form of nonviolent action.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, understanding constructive program opens up a whole new
Mm-hmm.
spectrum of acts that could be considered a part of resistance movement. So we're not just looking for the acts of civil disobedience,
Mm-hmm.
or if we're analyzing a movement. When we say, oh, well, they have arms,
Mm-hmm.
that this is a purely violent movement, so we don't
Mm-hmm.
have to pay attention to them. And if you look at the Zapatistas, yes, they're armed, yes, they hold on to anonymity at a certain level, but their work and constructive program is huge.
Uh-huh.
And it helps us to look at the broader picture of,
Mhm.
you know, PAX 164B,
Mhm.
the real world, the gray areas, that yes, there's some threat power, so to say, involved, but the majority of the work of the Zapatistas is constructive program. So
That's true, and you're raising the bugbear of Nagler's law, V plus NV equals V. I never was terribly good at math, but in other words, if you introduce a little bit of violence into what was otherwise a nonviolent movement, it might as well be a violent movement. Partly that's how it's going to be perceived, and partly you'll be vitiating the nonviolent force that you want to engage. So I don't know exactly where to go with that in connection with the Zapatistas, but I will say two things. I was at a meeting at a Quaker camp, Ben Lomond, down near Santa Cruz, so maybe about 20 years ago now, and a representative actually came to that meeting from the Zapatista front, and with a message for us from Subcomandante Marcos, who said, "You show me a different way and I will lay down my arms." So I think he had taken up arms unwillingly and could have been weaned away from it. At that point, we didn't have quite enough together that we could lay it out and say, here's some alternatives, send it down with that person, which, again, kind of redoubled my determination to get on with this work. So that is one thing. They took up arms, they thought out of necessity, and they would have been cheerfully laid them down. Now what's happened, in my opinion, to Israelis is that they took up arms out of necessity and got addicted to them through fear. And then now, the ideology back in the 70s was, well, these are just farmers. The minute the battle is over, they'll go back to their tractors. But that's not happening anymore. So that's one thing. But the other thing I wanted to add is perhaps even more important, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because building alternative institutions can even take a step further, which is building a new kind of institutions. So I think in the free speech movement, we basically didn't do that. We formed an executive committee, and we had committees and teams, and we basically followed the hierarchical model of organizing, which was the only model we knew. Right? And we just heard last night that for a while, in fact, it was working incredibly well. There was one fellow who said that he was given the job of going to Oakland and getting some papers and bringing them to campus. So he went up to Ludwig's fountain, which is kind of a central point in the campus. It was a big fountain. There was a dog named Ludwig who always used to bathe in it. It's called Ludwig's fountain. He stood up and he said, "I need 10 people to do some FSM work." And by the time he was finished saying that, 15 people had collected. One of them said, "I've got a car, I'll go get it." It was an amazing, amazing spirit. So sometimes you can use, the structure doesn't matter that much if you have the right spirit. But you can't always depend on having the right spirit, and the structure matters a lot. And what the Zapatistas have done is created a new form of organization, a couple of them. They have these autonomous communities, and they've created what they call caracoles, which is a Spanish word for snails, because they are like spiriform organizations. So it's not a hierarchical pyramid. There is some kind of centrality to it, but people all have input into it. I don't know exactly how the caracoles work. I'd like to find out more about it. But let's bear in mind that you can even take a qualitative step beyond alternative institutions. And nowadays, I guess, we have to be thinking in these terms, because the old institutions are not only being exploited and abused, they're wrong. They're the wrong kind of institutions for human development. You know, we do not need a United Nations. I should be standing on a soapbox and fulminating here, right? We don't need a United Nations, we need a united people. You know, and it's been proposed that we have a new entity where for every 1 million people there be a representative. And even the Norwegians are willing to go along with it, even though they'd only have 4 representatives and we'd have 230 or more. But so we happen to be at a unique cusp in history. Not that nothing like this has ever happened before, but we're at a point where we need entirely new models of organization, which is why I raised the topic of organization earlier, and I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to go into it more deeply. Now, there's one other advantage that I'd like to throw onto the list. I don't think it's as important as some of the ones we've been discussing, but I don't know. You make up your own mind as to which is more important. But Gandhi said, if you have conceived of your movement in a negative vein, that is, we are against fill in the blank, exploitation, racism, inequality, inequity in wealth, whatever, your movement will be short-lived, because whether you win or you lose, your movement loses its purpose when the issue is resolved. If you lose and you can't resolve the issue, it's all over. If you resolve the issue, it's also all over as a movement. Whereas in constructive program, you're looking to build something positive, and those movements have a great deal more durability. So they go, you know, from campaign to campaign, issue to issue. They're always building. So we're doing pretty well, but just a little slow, but it's been really good. I'd like to just add a couple of examples here before we take a break. The only movement that I am aware of, there's a couple that almost, but the only movement that I'm aware of in the modern world that did have both wings was the First Intifada. But they had constructive work going on out of necessity, not because they liked it. And it's remarkable how much more enthusiastic people will get about obstructive work than constructive work. You know, there's somebody came bursting in on Gandhi in the 1940s and said, "What's really going to get rid of the British now?" Hoping that he would say, "Let's drop all this nonviolence junk and really let them have it now that they're against the ropes." Instead, he said, "What's really going to get them out of here is phenomenal progress in spinning." You know, very undramatic. You don't get your name in the newspaper. And I can remember in the free speech movement, people coming to campus in the morning and holding up newspapers. "Here's a picture of me in Sproul Plaza." And it kind of took away a little bit. But what was I saying? In the First Intifada, they discovered the need for constructive work by necessity. So many families had both parents in jail that the women had to take care of the children. So that by the time it was over, as Mubarak Awad told me, every woman was every child's mother. Now you can imagine what this does to a community. That you can go to jail knowing that your child would be taken care of by someone who loves them as much as you do. It basically made the entire West Bank a single family. They had to provide basic groceries and education, policing, everything, because the Israelis withdrew it from them. And we see over and over again in nonviolence oppressors do something that they think is going to work for them, and it backfires. So the Israelis thought that this would reduce them to abject dependency, and instead it had the exact opposite effect of making them much more independent as a community. So the Intifada had both wings, but not quite a brain, right? I think Mubarak almost had that position with them, and a few other leaders. Then there's an interesting example of a movement that consisted of constructive program almost entirely and had no obstructive component, and that is the MST, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil. It is the most spectacular example of constructive program. The situation there is that the Brazilian Constitution states that if land is not being used and people come and use it and take care of it, if they're good stewards of that land, they can apply for the ownership of that land. Now, in Brazil, there were some wealthy landowners who owned the latifundias, or whatever they were called in Brazil, which were as large as Belgium. Can you imagine one family owning land like this, which of course they weren't using, and people in the millions were starving. They're landless. They either had to go into a favela, into a slum community, or just, try to figure out some way to survive. So it does not take the brain of an Einstein to say, here is, now I know I'm kind of sounding like a Zionist here. Here we have a land without people and people without land. So they would band together, and this is, again, the church was an important organizing element here, and one particular priest, actually. They would band together and go into these huge farms and farm them. Set up their own schools, their own clinics, their own governance, their own newspapers, and build this kind of society that they want, which in some ways was a deep alternative, different structure from the prevailing society. And they actually, I'm forgetting the numbers now, but I think something over 100,000 families were established in these communities. So from that point of view, it was a totally beautiful thing. But if you watch, there's a documentary film called Raiz Forte, Strong Root, on this movement, and it is subtitled. If you watch this film, there's a very unhappy episode or two where the landowners, of course, they have all of these resources, so they hire thugs, somehow they get control of the paramilitary, and even in some cases the government military, and they attack these people. And when they attack them, they don't know what to do. They're running around screaming, they're throwing stones at them, they're getting injured, they scatter in panic. It would not take much well, I think they need two things. They need some training, and they need a nonviolent intervention team. I think they had a few internationals standing there saying, you can't do this. And if they themselves had reached a point where they wouldn't have to fly into a panic about it, then that would be both wings. And we'd have an absolutely unstoppable movement. So, any questions at this point? Anything else we need to add to this list? Okay. If not, I'm going to propose that we do a very constructive thing, which is take a break, have a little something to eat. And for people who are watching this remotely, we're doing this a little bit differently today because the Petaluma Peace Harvest has started and we have to go downtown and do some tabling. All right, everyone, we're getting back into action here. And what I'd like to do is use this model that we've developed a while back. So if you would open your Google Docs, and the people who are here look up on the silver screen, and what you see is kind of a schematic representation of a world built on a principle of unreality. Should I turn that, Carrie, so you can see it better?
It's just too far away to
Okay.
to read it, so
Yeah.
at least I'm getting a visual.
Yeah. So in the middle of this diagram, we have unreality. Gandhi's concept of Sat, which he inherited from the Vedantic tradition, was extremely useful for him. So it's a root Sat, which is a second cousin of our English word is. The S in is and the S in Sat are actually the same, they're related. You can later tell us how you can say is in Polish and is in Swedish, and they're all going to be clustered around this. But in the way it was understood in Vedanta, it had three meanings. The most limited meaning was true as opposed to false. Right? So what we were talking about were cases where this was actually violated. The deeper meaning was real as opposed to unreal. So Satya, in that sense, is reality. Yeah. And this is where Gandhi, you remember that famous quote that we read a couple of weeks ago or last week, or it's on our Google Doc, where he said, because nonviolence is based on Satya, it cannot fail. And because violence is based on asatya or unreality, it cannot succeed. Its victory is out of the question in the long, long run. And it had a third meaning, which is good. In other words, there was, here comes my chai. It's going to enhance our performance for the rest of the meeting. Thank you. I have to say, we do make good chai here at the Metta Center. We being Stephanie. When we open up our Indian food restaurant that we were talking about, called the Restaurant for Non-Violence, NAAN. But let's get serious here for a minute. This implied a profound commitment that reality is essentially positive. And I don't think we can take that for granted. I don't remember if I shared with you these two slides that we made from movie posters, which would have been back in our first meeting, where the motto of these two films, I think they're films, they might be video games. One of them is, real ain't pretty. And, I forget what the other one was, truth hurts or something like that. We seem to have developed in popular culture a profoundly harmful, unconscious belief that the deeper you dig into reality, the worse it gets. So that the universe, in science we have the second law of thermodynamics, which states that order is constantly running down in any system. It just would naturally, over a period of time, deteriorate into meaningless, no information systems, which are known as, I guess that's what they call chaos, right? Yeah. And it's true that manifested orders are inevitably, what is it that the Buddha said to Ananda on his deathbed? Decay is inherent in all component things. Work out your salvation with diligence. Where your salvation is withdrawing your dependency on created things. So the decay is inherent in all created things implies that there is no decay in the uncreated. And at one point he actually said there must be an uncreated, a eternal, a changeless, because if there were not, there would be no escape from the created, the temporally bound, and the changing. So he had, most people do not understand this about Buddhism. And here I am, a Jewish Hindu, trying to tell them about it. That Buddhism is based on a profoundly positive concept of reality. And that all three of the traditions that emerged from the Vedanta, the so-called orthodox tradition that we now know today as Hinduism, and the heterodox ones that we know as Jainism and Buddhism, were based on a profoundly positive faith in reality, so that your life becomes figuring out what's your piece of the action and playing it out. And that's not to be taken for granted. As I say, we have now, in pop culture, it's more like the chart or diagram that you're seeing, where you believe that because nature inherently is violent, we have to control one another by force. And the inevitable result of this commitment to unreality as the basic underlying principle of stuff is all of these problems. On the top, we have globalism, because at the time when we created this model, globalism was absolutely the word that was on everybody's lips in the academic world, where I still was entrapped. And we have, of course, an enormous rate of crime, racism, consumerism, war, and poverty. All of those problems, you cannot avoid them once you have this negative commitment. If you think that there's not enough of anything to go around because nature hasn't been organized very well, you're going to end up in a crime-ridden society because people are trying to scramble, get from other people, and so on and so forth. I don't think we need to carry them all out in detail. But the fact that no one would dispute that we have all of these problems, but what this model proposes as an explanation is that they're based on an underlying wrong commitment, that reality is negative. So, now get ready for a dramatic shift. As soon as I can reach the mouse, and figure out how to do it, we will go over to the wheel of reality, which is based on Sat, or Satya, which is where the word Satyagraha comes from, which means holding on to Satya. Satya is just a grammatical form of Sat. And sure enough, Gandhi came up with these basic concepts, which were largely incorporated into Constructor Program, which, although he may not have thought it out quite in such detail, every one of his basic concepts is the antidote to the problem that's caused by the wrong basis. Okay? Now, usually when I do this, I have to just take one or two examples and zip on through. But now we have the luxury of spending as much time with this as we find useful. So you people out there in the remote world, we have to find a better name for them. Our international viewers, or the larger... Huh?
Outer space?
Outer space, yeah, the people in outer space. There's outer space, inner space, and cyberspace. Look at the second slide now, which is blue. And let's start with racism at 4 o'clock, because I really want to talk about this concept of Gandhi's, which is extremely useful. And it was a concept of heart unity. Very, very simple term and a very simple idea. The idea was that well, it's maybe not that simple, but let's start this way. Underneath all the differences in our manifested reality, differences of gender, appearance, personality, status in life, wealth, authority, underneath all of those differences is a common reality. The concept of Homo sapiens sapiens, named by himself. I'm not sure that's what God calls us, but we call ourselves the super intelligent hominid. But obviously we all have certain things in common. It's not just that we have them in common, but that on the spiritual level we are one. And that's at the heart level. So it's this difference between the heart and the surface. Now, to take this a step further, it's absolutely essential to realize unity at the heart level. That's why monotheism is such a big breakthrough. Because monotheism is, if you will, the model of our heart reality. What we think God is the model of our heart reality. And if that's one, then, we are one at that level. And here's the interesting thing. As important as unity is at the heart level, that's how important diversity is on the surface level. So if I try to squeeze people all into one category to create unity, I actually create the exact opposite. And that's what dictatorship is all about. You have, I don't know if you've ever seen these films of Hitler taking his oath at Nuremberg, where they just prided themselves on millions and millions of people being trained to look alike, act in unison, not have a stray thought. That's the kind of, it's actually a striving for unity, but on the wrong level. It's a misunderstanding what has to be underneath the surface at the heart level and trying to manifest it at the surface level. So the minute you see this is very comforting, because in order to be one with you, I don't have to be like you in these different ways. I could be myself. In fact, here's the curious and wonderful part of it all. Unless I am exactly who I am, I cannot realize my unity with you, because I'll be split. I'll be trying to be something that I'm not. This is where Martin Luther King had this beautiful statement, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. So your fulfillment actually depends on letting me be fulfilled by finding my Swadharma, figuring out who I am, and pursuing it. And our common for fulfillment is where we start to realize our unity with one another. When I was applying to be a conscientious objector in New York, a process which I couldn't finish because, as we would say today, we had children. In those days we used to say my wife had children, but we had them together. I was challenged by a doctor that I was working for. He was a Scottish doctor. He'd been in the Air Force, RAF, and he said, "You're not willing to do a thing for society." And I said, "This is my greatest contribution to society." I thought that over on my way home on the IRT subway up to 116th Street, and I realized that that's what I really was doing, that if I betrayed my deepest values and then went to society and said, "Use me," there wouldn't be a me there for them to use. It's only by my complete integrity that I become useful in the highest degree to others. So this wonderful unity and diversity concept of heart unity enables one to overcome differences of religion, for example, which were tearing India apart. Okay, so that's my favorite one, but let's move around clockwise. We get to 6 o'clock. You find the problem of consumerism, and his answer to that was his doctrine of simplicity. You find that 2 of these things, or maybe 3, fit in with Gandhian economics, which we won't have a chance to go into maybe in great detail. But simplicity meant that the ideal to strive for was simplicity in our external life, which is the opposite of what we've done by multiplying wants. We've led to this fantastically complicated external life. That Hunter and I were just trying to figure out why our road mapping wasn't working. It's because, you know, the technology is way beyond me anyway. We have, at the ashram, we've had teams of people working for days and days to try to get back online. Can't get back online, we can't have an ashram. You know, I don't know how the Buddha did it without the internet. But yeah, without electricity even, yeah. So to strive for simplicity in externals to reflect the unity that's within was a principle that he espoused. He had people practice it, and you can see what an incredibly simple outer life he had. You know, at the end of his life, he had like considered to be about $5 worth of material possessions back in that day. So you would not be able to have consumerism if people had an ideal of simplicity. You would walk past something that said a garage sale. You would say, no, thank you, I already have a garage. Or, or maybe you would say, I don't need one, you know, because I don't have a car. And this is something that you could solve, in other words, at the individual level, without, if you could get individuals to adopt it. And we human beings are such that we imitate one another a lot more than we think, and especially we imitate one another's happiness. I think that's why the Beats and the Beatniks and the Love Children of San Francisco had such an influence in society, because everybody felt perfectly miserable in their 9-to-5 jobs. I mean, now it's like more like 9 to 8. And they saw that these people were happy. They didn't quite, maybe they didn't quite understand there wasn't as deeply happy as a human being can be, but, you know, pretty happy. And that's made them influential. So similarly with simplicity, I think if people were happy with their simplicity, they could, those changes would radiate, even from key individuals who would become nodes of this change. It could oversweep a whole culture. I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen. Yeah?
I'd also say that simplicity is just like everything in nonviolence, like thought, word, and deed, too. So that simplicity in the thought level means thinking good thoughts of others, you know, thinking well of others, versus complicating, having very complex critical analyses of others.
Yeah.
You know, all of the, you know, simplicity in thought, simplicity in this sort of ties into truthfulness, honesty.
Yeah, it's reminding me of Gandhi saying that, you know, it looks like I lead this very complicated life, but all of my activities have their root in one simple thing, which is my insatiable love of mankind. Every one of them. So he's involved in 50 projects. Between Gandhi and Vinoba, they set up so many institutions that almost 1,200 of them are still functioning today. Just these two people. And you could look at that as a manifestation of great complexity. But underneath every one of these institutions is love for suffering people. How to give them work, how to give them medical support, whatever they needed. Yeah. And of course, it ties in with the fact that complexity of thought is, it just tends towards asat, towards unreality. Is a famous episode, to mention it again. Gandhi goes to the Round Table Conference in London in 1931. He speaks for 2.5 hours with no notes, no prompting box. And the journalists asked him how could he do that. They cornered his secretary, Mahadev Desai, and said, how could he do that? This is one of the most brilliant speeches we've ever heard. And he said, what Gandhi thinks, what he says, and what he does are all the same. That's the kind of simplicity that is, you know, goes beyond merely simplicity in possessions. He says, now for you and me, we say one thing, think another, and do a third, so we need to keep notes. Okay. Now, for the problem of war, there's this marvelous institution that Gandhi invented and almost put in practice. He was about to attend a meeting to establish Shanti Sena when he was assassinated. Actually, the evening before that meeting was to have taken place. But this idea of Shanti Sena, or peace army, meant that you would take all the good parts of a military operation, the organization, the dedication, and use them for peace instead of for harm, for war. So it would consist of volunteers who would go into a community and establish their presence there, carry out good offices, get trusted by the people, and then in times of conflict, they would intervene in some creative way. Often conflict starts off with rumors, and rumors blow up out of proportion very quickly. So if you can get in there, if there's a trusted third party who could say, you know, no, we checked, and they didn't actually carry out that massacre, you're okay. Sometimes you can stop a conflict from blowing up right there. They would carry out other good offices, like just recently, Nonviolent Peace Force participated in a meeting in Mindanao, which drew up a peace agreement for a conflict that I think had gone on for like more than half a century. And because they were a third party and they got themselves trusted because they took risks for other people, they were able to perform that service. And in the end, if nothing else has worked and conflict has blown up and there's a hot conflict going on, people are shooting, they may even be ready, willing, and able to carry out what's known as interposition. Okay, because we want to complicate everything, we call it interpositioning. And there was a famous case in the Western Sahara where a rebel group and the government were advancing on one another. And this was going to be one horrendous conflict. And a whole bunch of citizens, including women with baby carriages, just got in between them. Just say, you know, if you shoot, you'll hit us. And stopped it dead. And now that was an example of spontaneous uprising. This can also be trained and systematically institutionalized, which is what I'm always talking about, taking the good impulses that are within us and institutionalizing them. So I have actually made 3 videos about the history of what's now called unarmed civilian peacekeeping that the UN is using, UNITAR, in their curriculum, and you can see them there. In other words, I had better stop talking about Shanti Sena right now, or the rest of the semester will be all about that. You and I can talk later. Yeah, Jill?
You said take the good things about the Army, and you said organization and dedication. So in that case, do you think the military organization is a good thing?
Actually, the way they organize themselves is not useful. It's utter hierarchy. Though, I guess it can be made useful if your general happens to be Gandhi. And he literally said, I am your general. I expect implicit obedience as long as this campaign is going on. But he said, the minute you do not want me to do this, I'm out of here. Well, he didn't say, I'm out of here. He didn't say it that way. He said, I shall leave, or something like that. But so there were times when you actually need a single focus for strategic coordination. And because it was an emergency situation, it needed to be one brilliant person calling the no shots. Thank you. No, but you're absolutely right. In terms of a long-term organization for a democratic society, hierarchy and pyramids is not the way to go. In fact, we will get back to that. Okay, hold me to that. I have something else I want to share with you. So moving around now to 10 o'clock, we have a ghastly problem of poverty in the United States and throughout the world. And one of the concepts that he dreamed up that would be the solution is what he called trusteeship, which is the nonviolent equivalent of ownership. So, okay, let's take this computer for example. As far as the law is concerned, I own this computer because I paid for it with money that I bilked the citizens of California out of. I fooled them into giving me a salary to teach classics for many years. Anyway, be that as it may, honestly or dishonestly, I came by this thing. And according to law, if you take this computer and run away with it against my will, you will be violating the law, committing theft, and so forth. And my relationship to this thing is I own it in the eyes of the law. But to quote, was it Benjamin Disraeli who said, "If the law says that, sir, then the law is an ass." In reality, I have no permanent relationship to this thing. At some point in time, it's going to break down. Even an iMac, even a MacBook Air will break down at some point. And it'll be good for nothing but propping the door open or, filling some landfill or being sent to China to be taken apart for poisonous components or whatever they do with them. Even if it were to last for 100 years, as an embodied being, I am not going to last for 100 years. Sorry to have to divulge that in this august assembly, but at some point there won't be any me anymore. So who am I going to own? Thank you. So trusteeship is again a very powerful concept that relies on a change within the human being. As we liked to say in Metta, the problem is not one of putting a different kind of people in power, but awakening a different kind of power in people. So this is, if you will, the power of detachment, the ability to say, I use this tool, hopefully for the better, and as long as I'm using it, I have every right to use it. Should I stop using it or become incapable of using it, I have no more relationship to it. In either case, it does not give me status. My value does have nothing to do with this object. If we could spread that attitude, it would have an amazing effect on the economy. We'd have to reorganize it completely. Because the economy that we have now is all based on the lie of ownership. The opening verse of the Isha Upanishad, which is one of Gandhi's absolute favorites, the last part of the verse is, Kasya Svid Dhanam, who owns anything? Ownership is an illusion. Trusteeship is much less of an illusion, because we do have an inherent right to do work, and as long as I'm carrying out my Swadharma, helping the world, I have the right to use whatever tools I can for that purpose. In fact, while we're at it, Gandhi felt that there were 3 different categories of needs that should be taken into account in building up an economy. The basic level, and I didn't get to talk about this in San Rafael, the basic level is what do we need at the level of food, clothing, and shelter. There's to stay alive and operate in a human culture, we need food, clothing, shelter to be provided, and we have a right to those things, and beyond that, he would go so far as to say society has an obligation to construct itself in such a way that every single person has access to food, clothing, and shelter. So that's absolutely basic. And there would be no problem doing that, actually, because the world could produce enough food for everybody. There's enough sheep and cotton to put clothes on everybody. And I remember a colleague of mine from Brazil. He was a geographer. He went down to visit one of these favelas in Brazil, and he said the ants in Brazil have more elaborate homes than the people. The ants spend more time building themselves a good shelter under the ground with everything they need, you know, moisture and air and stuff. They put a lot of work into it. Pretty hierarchically organized, incidentally, so I'm not saying we should imitate their organizational pattern. But, you know, human beings are living in these tumble-down shacks. So up to that level, everybody has a right to those things, and society has an obligation to provide them. The next higher level are the tools that one needs for one's work. So I have a right to use this computer because I'm using it, as I say, I hope, for good purposes. And society has no obligation to provide me with that thing, but I have every right to get to use it. Anything beyond that is superfluous. It's extras, and you don't have the right really to own it, because anything that you have in your possession that you don't really use, you have taken from somebody else. He believed that the way the world was constructed was such that no person could have more than he or she needed without causing another person to have less. And we're seeing that on a huge scale today. We're 1/6 of the world's population, using 1/4 of the planet's energy, and so on and so. I mean, I don't need to quote the numbers for you. They're like the top 50 wealthiest people in the world own more than the bottom 40 countries, you know, stuff like that, numbers like that. So, one way to fix this incredible inequality was through trusteeship rather than ownership. Okay. And then moving around to 12 o'clock, we've already spoken about Swadeshi a number of times, but localism, regionalism was the answer to globalism. At this point, thank you, Jill, I'd like to introduce this model for a world order that Gandhi developed. You know, in the 70s, people became aware that the way the world was organized wasn't working very well, and there was a big project called the World Order Modeling Project, or WOMP, where they had these huge charts with little diagrams and triangles and boxes and circles. It never really got anywhere. But Gandhi developed what he called his oceanic vision. I realize we have one more item to talk about. We'll get back to that in a minute. And in the collected works, this is volume 91, 20th, page 325. He said, I'll read a paragraph or two, and I'll put this up on our Google Doc. Independence must begin at the bottom. Thus, every village will be a republic, or a panchayat. That was an ancient custom. It still exists in India, where you have a rule of 5 elders, panch being the Sanskrit term for 5. Every village will be a republic or panchayat having full powers. It follows that every village has to be self-sustained and capable of managing its affairs, even to the extent of defending itself against the whole world. Now, this is critical, because when we talk about having to defend other countries, I mean, the main argument is you can't defend yourself. You know, India, you can't defend yourself against the Japanese, so we're going to have to do it for you. And even after World War I, these smaller countries had to belong to a larger country so they could be defended, but there was no concept that they had some inner ability to defend themselves, because the only means of defense were violent. Okay. This is a bold claim, even to the extent of defending itself against the whole world. Now, it gets heavier than that. It will be trained and prepared to perish in the attempt to defend itself against any onslaught from without. Thus, ultimately, it is the individual who is the unit. This does not exclude dependence on and willing help from neighbors or from the world. That will be a free and voluntary play of mutual forces. Such a society is necessarily highly cultured, in which every man and woman knows what he or she wants and, what is more, knows that no one should want anything that others cannot have with equal labor. So it goes on, but I'll just paraphrase it. The individual serves the family serves the village serves the district serves the state serves the nation, there could still be nations, and the nation serves the world. That is, of course, the critical piece that is missing. That if you stop it anywhere, it degenerates into conflict and egotism. But if you don't stop it anywhere, if you go all the way up to the highest oceanic circle, then none of these units is going to be a problem. They're not going to hurt other units. You could have nations with their own cultural traditions and so forth. Okay? If there ever is to be a republic of every village in India, then I claim verity, or truth, for my picture, in which the last is equal to the first. Or in other words, no one is to be first and none the last. So working towards this could be said to be the ultimate goal of constructive program. And Gandhi felt that if constructive program were strong enough, you might not even need satyagraha. If you built something that was, impermeable, that was invulnerable, you might not even need to mount any kind of resistance against outside forces. Okay, so we have one other item in the real wheel, as I call it, and that is, what are you going to do about crime? Of course, almost everything that we've said so far will help to reduce the crime rate, but the ultimate institution or idea that he came up with that seems to address it most directly is education. Nayatalim. And we see this all around the world today. There's even a proverb, a saying in modern Greek, which means every time you open a school, you close a prison. And I know I participated in an education program in San Quentin for people who are quite serious offenders, 16 years to life. And I was told that in that program, the rate of recidivism, where people recommit crimes after being released, was 2%, compared to a national average of around 75%. Yeah, just because we were teaching them something, showing them that they were dignified, they had the dignity that they could learn as human beings. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could read these two parts, because we were just having a conversation about Maria Montessori.
Uh-huh.
And, she was really embodying the work of Nayatalim. So if there's this one paragraph and that's on Gandhi, and then this, the other, flip the page back.
Okay, do you want to read it yourself?
Well, because you're on camera. So
Okay.
So read the first part, and then you can comment. I think you'll be impressed.
This is the part where you have wow
Yeah.
in the margin? How did I know? So this is Maria Montessori. No, this is not Maria Montessori. This is a child, but she was a famous educator who met Gandhi. Yeah. In order to clarify at the outset what we mean by education for life, starting from birth, it will be necessary to go more fully into details. One of the world's national leaders, it was Gandhi, announced not long ago that education must become coextensive with life. And not only this, but he said that the central point of education must be the defense of life. This is the first time that any social or spiritual leader has said such a thing. That is just so incredible, the defense of life. On the other hand, science has not only declared this to be necessary, but has been proving ever since the beginning of our century that the extension of education throughout life could be made a practical success. Nevertheless, no ministry of public instruction has yet adopted the idea. And then, which therefore I hold?
Yeah, start with the first dot, because this part is really going into the connection between new education and really what's at the heart, what's at the heart of the work that we're doing.
My experiments, conducted in many different countries, have now been going on for 40 years. And as children grew up, parents kept asking me to extend my methods to the later ages. We then found that individual activity is the one factor that stimulates and produces development, and that this is not more true for the little ones of preschool age than it is for the junior, middle, and upper school children.
Keep going.
Okay. A new figure has arisen to greet our eyes, not just a school or an educational method, but man himself, or woman herself. Man, whose true nature is shown in his capacity for free development. It's just pure nonviolence, if you ask me. Whose greatness became visible directly mental oppression ceased to bear upon him. To limit his, which would be to limit his inner work and weigh down his spirit.
Keep reading. We read till the end.
Everybody okay with this? Okay. Therefore, I hold that any reform of education must be based on the personality of man. In which he says man, I mean human being. Man himself must become the center of education, and we must never forget that man does not develop only at the university, but begins his mental growth at birth and pursues it with the greatest intensity during the first 3 years of his life. I mean, this is even physically, we know what happens to the human brain in the first 3 years is just unbelievable. It's like the Big Bang going on in the skull. And if you put children of that age in a deprived environment, they never develop. Okay. To this period, more than to any other, it is imperative to give active care. If we follow these rules, the child, instead of being a burden, shows himself to us as the greatest and most consoling of nature's wonders. I remember seeing a milk carton which said that schools are our greatest natural resource. And I said, children are our greatest natural resource. Schools are just a way of taking care of them. We find ourselves confronted by a being no longer to be thought of as helpless, like a receptive void waiting to be filled with our wisdom. That's not what children are. But one whose dignity increases to the measure to which we see in him the builder of our own minds, one guided by his inward teacher, who labors indefatigably in joy and happiness, following a precise timetable, at the work of constructing that greatest marvel of the universe, the human being. We teachers can only help the work going on as servants wait upon a master. We then become witnesses to the development of the human soul, the emergence of the new man who will no longer be the victim of events, but, thanks to his clarity of vision, will become able to direct and to mold the future of mankind. I have to say, when I visited the local Montessori, I made a mistake. Actually, I wasn't supposed to go in, but I didn't know that. The sign was covered over by leaves. And so I opened the door and I saw these children walking by with their jobs. You know, they have job trays. And they were so happy. You know, you get to a point where you can kind of see whether a person is happy or not, especially a child. And it did not look like going into my classroom in Public School 193, where 30 of us were sitting at the desk, you know, doing somebody else's lesson. It's just a miraculous discovery. So sure enough, there is a film made by the BBC called Gandhi's India. And in that film, there's an interview by a woman who took a key role in Naitalim, in New Education. Her name was Asha Devi. And she, to this day, when the film was made, was still working in a Gandhian school. And this is the woman who the interviewer asked her, well, don't you think Gandhi was unrealistic, that he didn't take into account the limitations of human nature? And she kind of like burst like a stop photographer taking a picture of a rose blooming. Just blah, just kind of bloomed, and her fingers were fluttering in the air. And she said, there are no limits to human nature. Well, that was the ultimate thing that Gandhi taught her. Yeah. So we have a whole nother topic that we were going to launch into, and it was going to be a lot of fun, but we are kind of sorry to frustrate you in this way, but let me tell you what I suggest that we do, and we can do it individually and compare notes about it next time. There's a little book that came out in it was reprinted in 1945, but the original was earlier, called Constructive Program, Its Meaning and Place. And it was just a little booklet. After 1927, Gandhi didn't have time to write whole books. And in this book, he outlines the 18 projects of constructive program. So my proposal is that we take a look at this table of contents, which you've got in your Google Doc or in your hand, and ask yourself, what would they mean for us today? What would be the equivalent? Do we need it? There'll be a couple, let's see, there are a few terms here that you may not be familiar with. Number 4 is khadi, that was a spinning home cottage-made cloth. Number 14 is kisans, that means agricultural laborers. That would be that'd be the people that you work with, Jill, the braceros, and the Latino people who work among us. Adivasis meant the indigenous inhabitants. Sorry?
Indigenous what?
This was number 16?
Yes. And what did you, I didn't hear the
Oh, Adi means original, and Vasi means dweller. So this is like First Nations people. Yeah. So let's ask ourselves, do we have this problem today? I think we know what the answer is going to be in most cases. How does it manifest in our culture? And how would constructive program address it? Now I want to say just one other thing before we close, and by close I mean open it up and see if you all have any questions, comments. And that is that we have an enormous amount of constructive activities going on in this country today. I bet every single person in this room and in the wider community, we're going to have a contest where you people can come up with a name for yourselves. I bet every single one of us is working on something that could potentially be a part of constructive program. What's missing is the concept. We don't know that this is constructive program, and we don't know how to articulate it with a larger strategic vision, which of course is what Roadmap is about, and in our last meeting we will be talking about that to some extent. But it's encouraging to know that there's an enormous amount of constructive work that's already going on in small examples of every kind: community, economy, there's local currencies, organic farms, schools, etc., etc. So the real question becomes how to coordinate that into a single overarching program without sacrificing its diversity, and how to then couple that with obstructive action, with resistance.
Could you repeat that?
Starting from...
Sorry, the last two things you said.
Okay, so we need to do two things. We need to pull together all of these constructive projects into an overarching program with one idea somehow, which may mean that in some cases people will say, okay, this is my pet project, but it's not really the key project for the strategy right now that the roadmap community has come up with. So I'm going to drop this for the time being and work on the other thing, knowing full well that it'll come back to that. It may mean that, or it may mean that simply everything that everyone is doing, they will themselves be able to articulate how that fits into the big picture, which is, you know, Stephanie's great contribution. So in some way or another, it can't just be, you know, I'm going out to work on Stephen Gaskin's farm in Tennessee, you're working on Shanti Sena work in Oakland, which I think you could call a constructive program. It can't just be each of us doing our little silo and thinking, I've got the right action and you don't. And I can't tell you how much I have run into this. If you're not growing your own food, you're not part of the revolution. That you're, in fact, you're wasting our time. So there has to be some way of pulling this all together, which has to start in the mind and then be represented in practice. And then that, in turn, all has to be coordinated with civil disobedience or other forms of satyagraha. So we know when to do which.
So when it's pulled together, it's not pulled together in a hierarchical organization, as it were.
No, that was the old idea. There were two big anti-war movements, organizations in the 80s, SANE and FREEZE, and they thought that the way to harmonize their efforts was to create a single organization called SANE FREEZE, but all incorporated in the same hierarchical model. And I think, while I'm not as totally as ideologically opposed to that model as some people are, it is clear that it is not the single model for us anymore. That there needs to be something else, and it's not entirely clear what that something else is. But clearly, just if you remember what we just read from Maria Montessori and what we heard in Gandhi's Oceanic Circle, there needs to be a kind of organization which does not sacrifice the capacities of the individual, but on the contrary, enables, facilitates the full development of that individual. Okay, I think this is the job of the century, to figure that out. Yeah. So maybe that'll be our next course, or our next book, or our next hope tank, or some such thing. I'm glad you asked me to clarify that, Joel, because it's a biggie. Anyone? Cyber world has been remarkably quiet this time. Anything else? Okay. Well, I think we've done enough to feel that we're good trustees of our brains this morning. And so I want to remind you, if you're local enough, that we have a wonderful talk at 7 o'clock this evening at St. John's Episcopal Church with Kathy Kelly, and that this is the start of a week of activities that is called Petaluma Peace Harvest. And spread the word, come join us. Salute, Joe.
Questions, but I can ask it after.
Well, usually, Jill, your questions have proven to be useful for all of us, so go ahead and give it I can't say give it a shot, but try it out.
Okay, when you look at the elements around the reality, what was really coming up for me was how, and And I think it's the answer is based in the center, in the reality being good.
Uh-huh.
It seems to me that like, I shouldn't say every, but so many of the pleas to get involved in different movements
Mhm.
are all based on panic.
Uh-huh.
You know, and I
Yeah.
was wondering if there's anything in this circle that addressed the idea that paralyzing fear.
Yeah.
Because when I talk to people about why they don't get involved in movements, a lot of them is they're just paralyzed.
Yeah.
You know, I'm wondering if it's the center.
I think so. I think if once you've got a toe in that center, you have a way of overcoming fear. If you remind yourself that reality is good, and this up until now has been the property of the wisdom tradition. You know, you think of Juliana of Norwich in the 13th century saying that she saw reality to the very core, and the message that she came away with is that all will be well. All manner of things will be well. And we have lost track of that vision, and so to reconnect ourselves with it in whatever way we can is to overcome fear and hostility. Carrie.
Just to go back to Montessori for a second.
Okay.
Montessori said that when children work at deep levels of concentration, using the hand and mind together, they experience spontaneous joy.
Amen.
And in my experience, joy and fear do not inhabit the same space.
Yep,
They
true.
can't.
Yep.
And so when you look at a kind of education which, you know, really creates an environment where children experience joy, you know, upon joy upon joy, it's starting to create a foundation
Yeah.
to give people a well to come from other than fear.
Yeah. That's right.
And then in adult life, so much of what we are asking ourselves to do,
Yeah.
it's talking about not, how do I put this, it's about coming out of a place where there isn't fear.
Mm-hmm.
So as adults, we may have to learn how, as adults, to reconnect with that space, but it's lovely to have it as part of your foundation
Oh, yeah.
as a child.
Yeah.
So to provide that for a generation.
It's just so much easier if you have had that in the early stages of your life to reconnect with it. It's probably not impossible, even if you didn't have it, but it's so much easier if you've had it. It's just like you can just retrace your steps back to that joy. And I think today this is quite essential. A book called Breakthrough by Nordhaus and Schellenberger, which is probably on our list. And these are not wisdom tradition people. These are not visionaries. They're sociologists, in fact. And they have studied movements, social movements, and they had a number of things that they're able to pull out that are very, very useful. But one of them is that scare tactics are counterproductive. We just can't do it anymore. And you know, even a lot of organizations are saying, it may be too late, we can't fix this anymore. All that's doing is paralyzing us. As Norman Cousins used to say, nobody knows enough to be a pessimist.
There's a comment from online.
Okay.
John, he's saying that reflecting on Gandhi's Salt March as an act of civil disobedience, but at the same time is also constructive because it's about obtaining salt using local means.
Yeah.
And so I think the upshot is that all, you know, positive acts of civil disobedience would have an element of constructive resistance involved or a constructive program involved in some way.
Yeah, another way.
The salt is concrete.
Another way of looking at it, as you were just saying, is that it was concrete. You know, the climate march. You know, we've been asking ourselves, what should the climate march have done, or what should it do now? And we've said that it should come up with a concrete timetable and say we want this to be done by then, and a set of sanctions to make sure that that happens. So that if you do not, say, limit carbon emissions by such and such an amount by 2020, you are going to have to face massive civil disobedience. We're going to shut down factories, rail lines, and everything. Without that, I think it was just as an expression of feeling, but not an effective, what is a term that our friends in the free speech were using? Consequential speech. Not just speech, but consequential speech. Yeah. I think I would also like to run it the other way around, that if you based everything on constructive program and you didn't even think, what law am I going to break, it would soon become clear, because the system would not tolerate you building a brighter, happier world. At some point they would have to say, no, you do not deserve this happiness. Joy is wrong. And they would block you. But then you see, this is one thing we haven't mentioned yet. This is a biggie to put on this chart in our minds. Constructive program is proactive. Instead of saying, oh my God, you've ruined the environment, so now we have to do this, you're saying, we're building this kind of world. Get out of our way. Or join us. Yeah.
We were talking before about the big examples also versus the very personal examples, and I'm working right now with my colleague in this parenting class on positive discipline, and it's like the same way that being proactive in working with children, using that kind of constructive understanding of what can I change in myself in order to make the environment more open to keep the negativity out and the constructive elements flowing in it, was the same. I mean, it was the same principles of nonviolent resistance in a way, that you want to set up expectations too. So if you say you're going to do something, do it. Carry through on it. Follow through on it. So thinking about that in terms of a movement, if you're set up expectations and consequences, and if there's a consequence, follow through on your consequence.
Yeah. Otherwise, it just becomes speech, not consequential speech. I would actually think I'm starting to forget my train of thought. Yeah, actually, in our proposal, which we have yet to write for the follow-up to the climate march, there are 3 elements. Every person in the march, in the movement, should say, here's what I'm going to do. And that could be directly related to climate, like I'm going to switch to an electric car or move to North Germany or something. Or it could be I'm going to devote X amount of my time to educating myself and others around this movement, and then make a timetable. Actually, there are 4 elements. The timetable should not just say you need to reduce emissions X amount by Y time, but rather, here are the ways that you can do that. Look at the way Germany has developed sun and wind, and other Northern European countries. And so that you give them not only what you demand that they do or stop doing, but you give them a concrete way of doing it, make it possible for them. Remember Toynbee saying Gandhi made it impossible for us to go on ruling India, but he made it possible for us to leave without rancor and without humiliation. And that's the part that we always forget. Get off our backs and feel humiliated is what we usually say to oppressors, and because people cannot, they're constitutionally incapable of accepting humiliation, we always fail. So, and then finally, 3rd or 4th would be the sanctions. Here's what we're going to do if you don't comply. Yeah, Maya?
Wanted to write this down. So I volunteered to help make that come into the McKibben's hands.
Great.
This proposal. It's
Great.
incredibly important. And I want to say that it's clear to me that 350 at least have gotten several communications that they kind of don't know what to do with this.
Yeah.
Uprising.
Yeah.
And they're open to feedback. So
Yeah.
I think the moment is hard for
Yeah.
communicating just what you're saying.
Yeah.
I also also had a sense while I was watching the live reports from the big march in New York City last Sunday, that there was an element of like truth of what we are all seeing was very palpable. So I was thinking about this concept of truth. So it's not good, but it's true and it's real, and it's real to enough people that 400,000 people showed up in New York City. So I don't know if you have a thought or comment on that.
Well, I think that's a marvelous beginning, but it has to be followed up on it. And one thing that I did notice about this occasion, which was encouraging, even to me more encouraging than the large number of people who showed up, was the number of people who were saying, how does this become a permanent movement? Yeah. Okay, great. See you under somewhat different circumstances next week. We will try to record this meeting so you can watch it in advance. If you're local, come to Shri, Indian Cuisine on Western Avenue, and we'll talk about it there. And if you're not, what do we do with the people who are non-locals?
They'll watch it, and then they could email their questions.
Email their questions. Good. Okay. Great. Thanks, everyone. This was a very, very good conversation.